Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of the Goddess Project Gay Gods of Greece. Today, we're going to be talking about Poseidon, particularly around his lover Pelops. And this story, my friends, has the potential for everything from cannibalism to resurrection to love affairs to everything. So, welcome and hello. First, I'd like to say hello to all my new followers. This is a special series that I'm creating for Pride Month 2023, the Gay Gods of Greece. And I'm going to do a series of these short episodes this month and post them maybe a couple times a week. So we're going to talk about mythology. We're going to talk about heroes, gods, mostly Olympians, I think I'm going to pick on, but there's a couple others as well that I'm going to be working with. So if you're new to the channel, welcome and thank you so much for subscribing. If this is your first time watching me, I want to tell you that these episodes are unedited, so I never chop them up, and unscripted. And totally informal. My name is Carla Ionescu. I'm a PhD. My PhD is in ancient history, particularly ancient Greece and Rome. My area of expertise is the goddess Artemis, and Artemis is coming up very, very soon because Artemis has always had a queer vibe to her. And so I thought that we would have some fun this month. I've been wanting to do a series on Greek heroes and gods and the sort of queer stories around them. Now, some stories, like you've seen, if you watched the Amazons already, the Amazon episode, some stories are more implied intimacy and have the sort of complicated vibe around them. There's sort of an innuendo around them. But this story of Poseidon and Pelops is an absolute admission, if we can say that. There is an absolute love story between Poseidon and Pelops, and so we're going to talk about it. But first, we should probably talk about Pelops, and I should kind of let you know who he is. And I thought that I would also read you a little bit from primary source. You know, I love reading from primary source. Sometimes there is primary source, sometimes there isn't. But it's interesting that with the men, particularly with Poseidon, Apollo, Zeus, there is documentation of their love affairs with men and, of course, with women. But around the women, for example, like the Amazons, like Artemis, even Sappho, for example, there is innuendo and implication and assumption, but there isn't an actual story that says this female goddess or this poetess fell in love and was, deeply passionately or made passionate love with this other nymph or girl or whatever. So it's kind of interesting. I know we touched on it in the Amazon episode on how women around, especially women's sexuality in the ancient world, was not something that ancient male writers focused on unless it had to do with het sex or cis sexuality or some type of digression, affairs or cheating or things like that. So today we're going to look at Poseidon, and I hope that you'll enjoy learning about Poseidon and Pelops as much as I've enjoyed looking them up. And I absolutely love this image. If you're listening to me on Spotify, that's fine. You could just Google Poseidon and Pelops anytime you remember to do that. And you will find, especially fan art. Fan art is amazing. And you will find a variety of fan art around these two. And it's absolutely adorable. So let's talk a little bit about Pelops. Pelops. I'm sorry, I'm going to say that wrong a few times. Forgive me. Okay. He is the grandson of Zeus and the son of Tantalus and Dion. Dion is the daughter of Atlas. Okay. So Pelops is then the great grandson of Kronos. Certainly Pindar calls him the great grandson of Kronos, though there is this kind of allusion to Pluto. So Pelops, why can't I say this name? Pelops is really an interesting figure. And, as I was reading more about him, I'm wondering if he was an actual king, a real king. So there is a history of him becoming a king and having descendants and all this kind of stuff later. and this mystery around his shoulder, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I'm wondering if the myth is sort of written backwards. That is, there was probably a king named Pelops that had the shoulder issue, and then this myth developed around this story or this individual, and then that was passed down. So we'll see. We'll see what you think. But let's talk about creepy Tantalus first, because Tantalus is, I don't know, one of the most disturbing fathers. You know, there is this long history, and I don't want to go out too long on a side rant, but there is this long history in Greece and in Greek tradition of father and son relationships that are antagonistic. And in fact, many fathers fear their son. And I think we've talked this I must have said this in previous episodes, where the Kronos, for example, fears Zeus. And there's this idea that fathers are going to be replaced by their sons. And so that really plays into the way that stories are told about fathers and sons, and that relationship tends to be antagonistic. There's a territorial aspect to it, but very few fathers. There are a few, but not that many that actually kill their children and use them as a tool to try to manipulate the gods. So let me tell you the story about this feast of Tantalus, which is, as you can see behind me, this feast of Tantalus. So Tantalus, who was a favorite of the gods really, really like him, decides one day to test the gods and see whether or not they could tell what they're eating. So, you know, people offered sacrifice to the gods. This is quite popular. And Tantalus decides, you know what? I'm going to create a meal for the gods, and I'm going to see if they can tell what the heck they're eating. What possesses him to do this? Nobody knows. So he decides to invite all the gods for dinner, an honor already, right? Like all the Olympians are coming for dinner. And he decides to slaughter his own son, Pelops, and boil him, chop him up, boil him, and set him on the dinner table for the gods to eat, to test whether or not the gods really taste, I say in quotation marks, their meals or their sacrifices. And of course, right away, the Olympians know what it was and do not touch it. But Demeter, who is absorbed in her grief at this time, she has lost Persephone. So she's come to dinner, but she's just so absorbed in her grief. She eats a piece of the meat. She eats some of the meat, okay? Sometimes people say this is Thetis, not Demeter, but most of the ancient scholars agree that this is actually Demeter, and she eats the shoulder of Pelops, okay? Now, Zeus is so disturbed by this event that he throws Tantalus. He's so angry. He orders Hermes to put Pelops into a cauldron. Take all the pieces of Pelops and put them away, put them into a cauldron, okay, and restore him to life. And then he decides to throw Tantalus into the depths of the underworld, where he will be tortured for the rest of his life. Okay, so there's something really disturbing here about Tantalus and his plot. So what happens to poor Pelops? His body pieces are all in this cauldron, and there's different people that are said. So some scholars say that the Moirai or the Fates put Pelops back together. Some people say that Hermes put them back together. So there's a few people that say the gods. So many of the people, some people say Rhea restored Pelops, and Pan danced around in happiness. There's all these kind of stories of the restoration or the recreation. But this is really a reanimation of a human. So what happens is all of these gods get together and they put back together poor Pelops. But because Demeter had ate his shoulder and his shoulder is missing, they decide to replace it with ivory. And so Pelops from now on has an ivory shoulder. And they say that all of his future descendants carry this kind of white mark on their shoulder, which is the mark of this ivory. So I thought I would read from you just briefly from Ovid. Ovid, in his Metamorphosis, writes about this recreation. And he says, Tantalus had dismembered the boy, and the gods, so they say, reassembled the limbs. The rest was recovered, and only the part which unites the neck with the upper arm, so the shoulder, had been lost. And a piece of ivory set into the empty space could serve the purpose as well, and Pelops was fully restored. So there is this recreation, fascinating recreation of Pelops from pieces. It very much reminds me of the story of Osiris, for example, when Osiris is in pieces and Isis is looking for him, and then she puts him back together. It's very much resonant of that story of putting pieces of a dead body back together and breathing life into them. And this is exactly what the gods do to Pelops. Now, in this process, we learn that Poseidon falls in love, so in love with the beautiful boy, Pelops, that he carries him off to Mount Olympus. And that for a long time, Pelops lives and stays with the gods in Mount Olympus and becomes Poseidon's lover. Now, there are different, so Pindar states that, Lucian states that, a couple of people state that in ancient scholars or primary texts. But one of my favorite parts is that there's a depiction of Poseidon creating a chariot that is led or harnessed to a couple of Pegasus, horses with wings, that and it's this gold, beautiful chariot that takes Pelops up to Mount, actually takes Pelops and Poseidon together. They ride off, almost like they ride off into the sunset, but they're riding off up this mountain together, and they spend an inordinate amount of time. There's no real depiction of time up in Mount Olympus together, sort of sequestered in their rooms, making love and falling in love and all these kinds of things. And then we learn, of course, that Pelops comes down from Mount Olympus, and at some point he ends up in a contest with a man named Oenomaus, and he's challenging Oenomaus for his future wife, Hippodamia, who Pelops wants to marry. And there's a sort of battle back and forth, and Pelops defeats Oenomaus in a chariot race, which is kind of interesting because he was taken up to Mount Olympus by his lover Poseidon in a chariot, and now he becomes so skilled at charioteering that he defeats, some of the greatest charioteers of his time. And of course, he ends up winning the hand of Hippodamia, and Pelops ends up having many children and descendants with Hippodamia. He then goes with her, and he has lots of children with her and all that kind of stuff. And the sons of Pelops himself with Hippodamia become entangled in some interesting stories. So I'm going to read this from you. So Chrysippus, who was the favorite of his father, of Pelops, one of his sons, rouses the envy of his brothers, who in concert with Hippodamia prevails upon the two eldest among them, Atreus and Thyestes, to kill Chrysippus. They accomplished their crime and threw the body of their murdered brother into a well. And there's the stories about who killed him, whether it's Atreus alone or Atreus and Thyestes. Either way, this continues the story, the patricide lineage, the brother side lineage in Pelops's family. And so Pelops then ends up expelling his two sons for killing his one son. And all of this drama follows poor Pelops. In fact, one could argue, and then he's very angry at his wife Hippodamia, who he blames for not paying attention to the boys or even being in cahoots with the boys to kill the oldest son. Anyway, she ends up running away and hiding in Olympia in a grove called Altis. And there's a statue to her supposedly. So his whole family. So once he leaves Poseidon, so we are not sure how come he leaves Poseidon, but once he leaves Poseidon, Pelops has like a devastating life. Yes, he's a great charioteer. Yes, he wins the hand of the bride that he wants, and he has 3 sons. But again, the curse of patricide and homicide is in his family, and his whole life sort of crumbles after that. Although he's remembered well, historically speaking, his life is not the same. One could argue that he should have stayed with his lover Poseidon. Now, what about Poseidon, you ask? Where's Poseidon in this? What's fascinating to me is that I'm always torn about Poseidon, because he can show some love and affection for some people that he favors, but he is also, just like Zeus, and just like many of his, his other brothers and sisters, except Hades, who actually is quite subdued compared to his other brothers. Poseidon does rape Medusa. Poseidon fights and loses to Athena over Athens. Poseidon has some issues that are unlikable. But interestingly, for the purpose of our episode today, he is a man who loves both men and women. And of his lovers, Pelops is his most favorite, most dedicated lover. And the reason why we say this, and the reason why we know this, is because we are told that he takes this lover to Mount Olympus. Now, of the women that he seduces throughout his mythology, he never takes any of them to Mount Olympus. In fact, he never takes anyone else to Mount Olympus. And so we know that Pelops is a key lover for Poseidon. The only thing that we are not as aware of is why Pelops leaves, or how he can leave Mount Olympus, and how he ends up leaving Poseidon. But that being said, much of the story about Pelops is about sort of his heroic deeds and his tragic life. And I would say that ancient scholars and early classicists did not make a very big deal about the fact that Pelops is the one and only and favorite lover of Poseidon. So I'm here to do it for them. I'm here to wring out, all of the gayness around Poseidon and his lover. And so in popular culture, we often see Poseidon depicted in this uber masculine way, and that's perfectly fine. But we lean very heavily on this uber masculinity equaling cis heteronormativity. And perhaps for some of you, it would be interesting to learn that someone that you might see as cis heteronormative and sort of the epitome of masculine or machismo is a lover of men. I mean, I don't think anyone should be surprised, because as I've said earlier in the last episode, Greek men, and I mean, I just want to be honest, but all men, yes, I said all men, in the ancient world have ancestors. I'm trying to see how I can frame this. Have ancestors that at some point were the lovers of men. Yeah. That is a broad and impactful statement, perhaps, but one that I think can be supported by history, in the sense that all over the globe, in every culture, if you dig back enough or far enough, or in the military or during wartime or wherever you want to dig, across the world, geographically speaking and culturally speaking, you will find men who love men in every single culture. And especially if we dig back before the limitations of monotheistic religion, the limitations of machismo patriarchy, the limitations of toxic masculinity. There have always been men who love men, always. So yes, I'm saying that. Yes, you may disagree. I mean, it's history. It's not written in stone. Ha ha ha. Technically, it was written in stone at some point. But one of my favorites that I'm going to do this month that is not in Greece is going to be Gilgamesh and Enkidu, because sorry, I just kind of went to Gilgamesh and Enkidu because the story of Gilgamesh is written in stone. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu are very clearly lovers. And so since the beginning of time, people have loved people in a variety and diverse and inclusive and fluid way. Okay. And so those stories may have been hidden, or those stories may have ignored. For example, I'm not sure how many people know that Poseidon is gay. I say this in quotation marks because the Greeks wouldn't have used the word gay. But I don't know how many people are aware that Poseidon enjoyed the wiles of his lover, his male lover. But it would not have been surprising or shocking or even anything for the ancient Greeks or for anyone in the ancient world, particularly for a god, because that would have been a dominant submissive relationship. And Greek men in particular had very strong rules around dominant and submissive relationships. So for example, or they had rules around the penetrator and the penetrate-e. And so there was this kind of a relationship of power. And so, for example, if a man was wealthy or if a man was older and he took a young lover, usually he would be the dominant, while the young lover would be usually, and I mean, we're not in everyone's bedrooms, and certainly the ancient historians were not in everyone's bedroom, but the idea was that the dominant partner, and I don't mean this in a mean or unloving way. It was very, I mean, every relationship is different, but the dominant partner would have rewarded the submissive partner with wealth, with love, with status, with etc. Yeah. In the same way, you could argue that Poseidon offers Pelops this stunningly gold chariot with these two Pegasuses, and then sort of makes him this brilliant charioteer and takes him out to Mount Olympus. And so there is this relationship that is a bit about power here, and it is about position. And the Greeks really cared about that. That was very important to them. And so their male-to-male relationships were not always egalitarian. In fact, I would say they were almost never egalitarian. There was always a bit of a power struggle or a power establishment in the relationship. And it was the power relationship was complementary to both. That is, both members entered into the relationship willingly and understanding their position. But there is quite a bit of talk around who is the dominant and who is the submissive. Excuse me. So for Poseidon and Pelops, is no surprise that it follows. I mean, the stories don't have to actually outright say it, because that would have been understood, but there is this very clear line of power. Now, again, this is not something that needs to be duplicated in our modern world, in the sense that it doesn't define gay or queer relationships at all, or fluid relationships at all. It doesn't have to define it, or it doesn't have to shape it, but it's just an interesting way that the Greeks viewed these relationships in the ancient world. Today, we see Poseidon represented in a very cis way. And I've given you some examples here of Poseidon in Percy Jackson stories. You can always identify Poseidon because he's got the trident in his hand. And Poseidon in Clash of the Titans looks like an old cis man, and it's implied that he's an old cis man holding the trident. And we even have some associations between Jason Momoa's Aquaman and this sort of mucho machismo, right? Which implies cis normativity, but doesn't always mean cis normativity, in the sense that I think that there is in our society at large, especially for maybe people who are not in the LGBTQ2 plus world, or have contact with anyone that identifies in that way. I think that there is, and so I mean more like Hollywood and sort of stereotypical cis normativity or representation. I think that people assume that, and I hate to say this in 2023, like I really hate to say this, but I've had some conversations even with friends or acquaintances, even this past Pride Month, where people will say something like, I don't have anything against gay people, I don't have anything against gay men, but I don't like the flamboyant ones. And I'm shocked and automatically in active mode, activist mode, as a member of the community and as an ally, to gay men. It irks me so much, that it's 2023, and perhaps I'm going to blame Hollywood, but it's the perception that masculine men are not gay, right? That or the perception that cis men must not be feminine, right? Even that perception is problematic. And yeah, it just annoys me. Sorry, I'm going on a rant. It just annoys me that we're still there. And these images, for example, of Poseidon are trying to reinforce this idea that here is a god that is very cis and very, very heteronormative and very masculine and blah, blah, blah. No way could he have been a gay. And I say that in quotation marks again, because in Greece, they wouldn't have had that word. But yeah, he is. Yeah, he is. And publicly so, and unapologetically so, and nobody gives a shit. I dare you to tell Poseidon he can't have a male lover, And so, yeah. And so I think that there is so much in ancient lore and ancient storytelling that would be so wonderful if it was done. But you know what? I'll tell you this. If we had, I would bet that if we had a story of Poseidon and Pelops and their love story, and Netflix decides to make one, I can bet you that a percentage of the population will watch the story and go, oh my God, now they're making everything gay. Because that's the other thing I've heard this Pride Month and other times that really annoys me as well. And my answer to that is, it's always been gay, honey. Like always. It's always been there. It was there 3,000 years ago, It's just that you don't know it, And so that's my service. That's what I'm doing here, friends, especially this month, is that I am bringing what is already there, nobody edited, nobody rewrote it. It's already there. It's just many people don't talk about it. Many people don't know about it. And it's not something that's often discussed, for example, when we talk about Poseidon. But I am here to peel back a little bit of those layers, especially for those of you listening to me, and read to you like I did from primary source, so that you know that these stories are part of the culture of the ancient Greeks, and wonderfully so. That is, these stories are not banned, and they're not, like I said, very unapologetic. So no one would have blinked an eye. No one would blink an eye if any of the Olympian gods, or like I said, Gilgamesh and Enkidu and others, if any of their gods have, let's say, same-sex lovers or same-gender lovers, no one would have blinked an eye. And it's time that we get there. It's time that we tell stories in which there are cis people and non-cis people and fluid people and all kinds of people, and we can tell stories and no one blinks an eye. That's my goal. That's my hope. And so I hope that by telling on Poseidon and telling this story about Poseidon, I hope that was kind of fun for you and maybe something new, or not. Maybe you already knew the story and you just wanted to hear me tell it. And feel free to Google any of that stuff and look up any of that stuff. And I hope that you've enjoyed this short episode on the gay gods of Greece. And remember that while it is Pride Month this month, Pride is every day. I'll talk to you guys next time when we'll look at Artemis and then Zeus.